Good morning and welcome to the webinar, Beyond the Pandemic, Interoperability and Artificial Intelligence in Healthcare. What a timely and great topic. So with no further ado, let's get started. This is Dr. David Nace, Chief Medical Officer here at Innovaccer, and I'm so pleased to have so many of you join us and also to welcome our panelists. So first of all, I'd like to welcome Dr. Jim Weinstein, who is the Senior Vice President of Microsoft Healthcare. And many of you know him for his many contributions as CEO and President of Dartmouth Health System and as Director of the Dartmouth Institute and creating the Dartmouth Atlas for so many years. Jim, welcome.
Thank you. Great to be with you, David.
Nice to have you.
Thank you.
And Dr. Glenn Steele, good friend over the years, Vice Chair of the Healthcare Transformation Alliance, large employers that are trying to transform the way they think about healthcare for their employees, and former, as many of us know us, Geisinger Health System President and CEO. Glenn, welcome.
Good to be with you, David. Good to be with you, Jim.
Great. It's kind of like a little bit of a reunion for the two of you to get together, right?
Fantastic. We're glad you brought us together.
It's really nice to have you both here. So this issue of artificial intelligence, Jim, you've been at Microsoft now for a few years, a real leader in AI. Help us demystify this. What really is AI and what isn't?
I think it's a set of computers trying to sense, comprehend, and maybe act and learn like we do. I'm not sure we're there yet, but the ability is there, and one could only imagine what the future looks like. I think Satya Nadella, who's our CEO, would say in healthcare, it is the secret to the future, where computers can do things that humans shouldn't have to do. And we're making great strides in that attempt.
So it's not going to replace us.
No, I think it will augment us, as opposed to artificial. You might use the word augment intelligence. And I think that, there's many disciplines within healthcare outside of the practice of medicine that might be replaced, in some areas. But I think from the physician standpoint and the leadership standpoint, computers can't, at this point, act like humans and respond to various different situations. So as Glenn and I were surgeons, sometimes you run into stuff in the middle of an operation you didn't expect. The computer might not adapt to that as a human does. So I don't see it being a total replacement.
So it sounds like it won't solve all of our problems in healthcare, but it can really add a lot of value.
Well, I think we'll probably get into some examples, but I think the technology is at a point today where even CMS now pays for artificial intelligence use in stroke diagnosis. So that was just approved. And that kind of opened Pandora's box now, because once money's involved, people get serious, and especially healthcare, because if you can get reimbursed, I want one of those, right? So we're going to have to be careful here, but Pandora's box is now open.
Well, that's a very interesting comment about Viz AI, and it's kind of like fee for service for artificial intelligence. It's an interesting concept, and we do need to be careful. Yeah. AI, I get it. It relies on data. We think of data as potentially the new gold, and AI can give us insights. It can give us a recommended action, or it can take actions like a self-driving car. But Glenn, data in healthcare is a bit different, isn't it?
Well, first of all, I agree completely with what Jim said. I think we should change the term from artificial intelligence to augmented intelligence, because that takes away a lot of the magical thinking that we often end up moving towards if we think about artificial intelligence. I think the big issue in healthcare data is the disaggregation and compartmentalization. So if we look at claims data, we have a huge amount of compartmentalized data. First of all, there's very little all payers claim data that could technically be put together. And if those data were available to those of us who were designing systems, we could stratify our systems in a much more rational way. That's just one example. If we look at healthcare provision data, it's so compartmentalized, and a huge amount of it rests within the national third-party administrators trying to get that data to help us understand what kind of care is efficient and produces the most optimal quality. It is very difficult if it's all compartmentalized and not available to the patients themselves, or not available to people who buy healthcare. And so technically, and there's a lot of political issues, there's a lot of regulatory issues, what have you, but I think technically right now, there's no great challenge. We could put those data together to the benefit of the people who are designing care and giving care, and most importantly, to the people who are getting care.
You know, I think to Glenn's point, David, I think you know, a lot of the CMS rules on interoperability and FHIR will help create the architecture to allow that, much like Innovaccer is doing your company. I think the ability to aggregate this disparate data, as Glenn was speaking to, is not a challenge. The challenge is the rules, regulations, and the self-interest. And so I totally agree with what Glenn just said. I think the push by the federal government in this way, starting back in the Obama administration with interoperability and HL7 moving to FHIR, was extremely important, and is a pathway that as a country, United States, let alone the rest of the world, can't afford not to do anymore.
Yeah, back in the days of Geisinger, where we had both a payer and a provider in the same fiduciary, it was a lot easier for us to put the claims data together with the actual caregiving data. And that helped us not only to design different strata of interaction with, you know, the high-risk patients or the, you know, the healthy people that we were dealing with, but it also allowed us to look at the bell-shaped curve and how, you know, how the care was given. And quite frankly, we could look at the ends of the curve and we could manage improvement for the wrong end of the curve. And that was more important in how we fundamentally changed the way care was given and the value proposition than simply changing the incentives in terms of how we paid the docs. It was the data flow that was the sweet spot that we could easily do, you know, because Geisinger was such an unusual fiduciary structure. And the real question, and what Jim is working on, and other organizations that are really terrific organizations like Innovaccer, is how you scale that data flow and that linkage and that, you know, kind of emancipation from compartmentalization.
You know, I think about how we had such great hopes, you know, 6-7 years ago, creation of the ONC and the stimulus bill. Let's focus on digitalizing healthcare. But, you know, many of the docs now complain about their I think as this slide says, computer jockeys. Maybe AI gives us an opportunity to help us move beyond that. Jim, there's already a lot of applications, I think, in AI within our healthcare arena, both healthcare delivery, payment, and life sciences. Can you walk us through some of those examples? I know you're doing a lot at Microsoft.
Yeah, I think first, coming back to, we can build systems, and augmented or artificial intelligence is important. But as Glenn alluded to, one of the big problems is, as you know, bringing the disparate data together. So I think what Innovaccer is doing in that space is extremely important. Then you can apply these kind of tools for databases, which in the computer science world aren't that big. People talk about big data, unless you get into genomics and imaging. But if you think a lot about text analytics and the productivity of physicians who feel overwhelmed in healthcare with every new gadget, there's something more I have to do as a practicing physician or nurse. Actually doesn't make my life happier. In fact, I think issues of people withdrawing from healthcare is fairly significant. We're going to have huge shortages. But when you look at the opportunities, one of the partnerships Microsoft did was with Nuance, which Dragon Medical One, which is the major dictation system most physicians use in the country. And taking that dictation and now being able to have ambulatory clinical intelligence. I don't even need a dictation tool. I can just sit in the room and talk to my patient, have that text structured and unstructured get structured into the typical SOAP note that people use for healthcare in the record, and being placed into you know, an Epic or a Cerner or whoever's health record automatically, and then the doctor just has to check that. Not only that, have the ability to use that data in a structured format to help in diagnoses and applications. If you take COVID recently, and who should go to the emergency room and who should have a telehealth visit, our bot technology, robotic technology that we did for the CDC and almost every organization in the world led that kind of artificial intelligence, in this case, augmented intelligence, to have the right workflows happening at the right time with the right people. So the ability to use these kind of technologies is incredibly personal, but also decreased in many institutions we work with ER visits by 30%. You have imaging on this map. Obviously, medical imaging is a huge category. And one of my colleagues, Greg Moore, who worked with Glenn at Geisinger, is now leading that part of Microsoft. And we're so excited because medical imaging with augmented intelligence can get to more diagnostic accuracy with earlier diagnoses, COVID, lung cancer, pneumonia. Chest radiologists, go through thousands of x-rays a year, but their ability to pick out these little things is not as good as the machine when you're talking about an image. So I think that's a huge opportunity. You have fraud detection on here, which is also a huge problem in healthcare. If you look at the claims data Glenn was talking about, you can use AI to get these kind of algorithms to show where fraud is likely to have occurred or will occur. So I think the opportunities are vast, but I still question, have we made the life of the physician and, more importantly, our patients better? And I'm not sure yet.
Yeah, it sounds like part of that may be not only getting everybody to work together as a team, but having them operating off the same page, so to speak, and having AI help to assist that. I think as you were talking about with augmented intelligence.
Yep.
Glenn, I know you've thought a lot about, how do we get more precise around the way we think about therapy and timeliness. Where do you see the future here for AI?
Well, I think it's important to start with the concept of re-engineering the care and then trying to figure out how the enabling technology gets us there. I think if you start with the enabling technology, quite often you don't have a logical kind of endpoint that you want to arrive at. And a good example of that is redesign of primary care. I mean, for years, we've been hearing about the fact that the pipeline for primary care is inadequate. That the job of the primary care physician, particularly as we have more and more regulations and we have MIPS and MACRA and all that crap, they can't see patients and they can't do the kind of quality job that we want them to do because they're distracted with all this other, regulatory stuff. Well, the issue that that we were able to address at Geisinger and that we're trying to scale now is how do you fundamentally redesign the job of the primary care physician? And how do you encompass the primary care physician as a team, not as an individual? And your endpoint should be, there should be different frequencies of interaction between the primary care physician and the panoply of patients that he or she is responsible for. So then how do you use data enabling to get those stratifications done in a reasonable manner? Now, once you get those stratifications done, how do you enable a lot of the caregiving to be distributed digitally, not physically? And then the next question is, how do you get the appropriate referrals when necessary for a type 2 diabetic to see an endocrinologist, but not have every type 2 diabetic seeing an endocrinologist? Or for reactive depression, particularly with kids, how do you establish an algorithm for the perfect transfer to a clinical psychologist or a psychiatrist with particular expertise in dealing with reactive depression amongst kids? Now, all of that stuff starts, as far as I'm concerned, with the design principle of where you want to end up as you redesign primary care. And then you take this remarkable technology and say, how do we use that technology to enable these changes?
No, that makes
just to pick up on Glenn's comments, David, and to your slide, I think, primary care has always had a tough road, and the reimbursement for them, which probably keeps a lot of people out of primary care, is also complicated. But you see what payers are doing and basically buying primary care practices, whether that's United, which has now the largest primary care practice in the country. I think what Glenn was speaking to is a re-engineering. What is that digital journey, and where does technology help along that path in a pregnant woman? Monitoring her, how many visits do they really need to the doctor? Is telemedicine and those interactions with her claims data and history going to project that she's somebody who could have a problem with her pregnancy in the third trimester? All those things are now possible today. And when you have precision medicine here, I think cancer is a place where artificial augmented intelligence is going to play a huge role. We've developed molecular tumor boards at Jackson Laboratories where there's 4,000 new articles a day in cancer. You can take that, read it with a machine, and actually put into the right segment a diagnosis of pancreatic cancer with the right markers to the right best treatments with the best evidence. And you can start to actually use these tools to have much more efficient and effective care. And then that gets into your population health and machine reading. But from a population health standpoint, in COVID, we took Atlas-like data that I've done for my career. We predicted the risk populations way before they even got sick. I did that in March or February. And if you look at it, we published it in Health Affairs. If you look at that, every one of those communities became red. And we should have known that as a country. We should have used that kind of information, whether it was for PPE, ventilators, medications, or just protecting nursing homes. We should do better with large data systems upstream. But if we don't collaborate as a CDC, as a commercial set of insurers, as hospital and health systems, we're just allowing people to be hurt unnecessarily.
So I think that raises an important question. This is such a rich discussion. I'm gonna kind of move ahead here and go into the issue that everybody's thinking about today, which is this pandemic. In many ways, we talked about, the beginning of digitalization and how we talked about AI and the ONC and FHIR, but we have only made incremental progress, even thinking about changing payer-provider model. But then this pandemic came, and it seemed to really expose many of the vulnerabilities You've both run large health systems. Tell us about what your peers have experienced given the investments they made up to date and what this pandemic showed for them in terms of where they were heading.
Or I can start at 35,000 feet, David. Whenever there's a crisis, whether it's in a given business or a national or worldwide crisis like COVID-19, there are three fundamentals that you need in order to deal effectively with a crisis. Number one is leadership. Number two is data. And number three is trust. Not in that order. I think they're all equally important. And we had no national leadership, number one. Number two, we've had kind of chaotic regional leadership, but they're certainly not coordinated. And then as far as data is concerned, this was a new infectious agent. So we're kind of learning as we go, and the data is accumulating basically. But we're left now with a real trust issue as we get closer and closer to effective vaccines. The proof of the pudding here is going to be people trusting that the vaccines are actually safe and effective. And I think that as far as enabling technology, augmented intelligence, I think we're going to have the technical abilities to monitor in real time who gets vaccinated and to actually do post-marketing surveillance on steroids. So I'm moderately optimistic about the ability to actually create more trust as we have real-time data looking at the distribution and the effects of these various vaccines. And I'm a positive guy, so I'm always almost Pollyannish. So I'm always thinking about how this stuff could be positive. Now, as far as the effect of the pandemic on the institutions, the provider institutions have been under great pressure. And I think, there are several takeaways that will continue post-COVID. And one of the takeaways will be the digitalization of a good deal of their caregiving. And so, that may be one of the few good things because of regulatory changes, that will help to create a business model. This is what Jim said before, where there's money, there's commitment. But there may be a business model that will allow for much more continued digitalization of how we care for patients post-COVID.
I guess I would say to Glenn's 3 points, leadership, it's sometimes hard to lead across such a diverse set of populations, but I think absent the data, which is the second point, it's hard to lead sometimes. And we're kind of fixing the airplane while it's in flight here. And the actual ability to implement these strategies effectively, I think, have been really complicated. But I guess my strong sense is that AI technology and the development of new vaccines, as we're seeing, is so rapid compared to the past. And I know because of our GPU capacity and high number of computers and high-speed computing, we've been able to, in vitro, actually look at the COVID binding sites for different treatments in vitro that actually accelerate the potential to develop and identify the right binding drugs in these vaccines. So I think we're going to be able to do a lot more with computing to actually get to treatments that are likely to be successful because of technology. And the ability, the one thing I hope happens that I'm fearful won't, is the sharing of information. Because some group will have enough knowledge about how we prevent the next COVID-20, right? Or what the next vaccine needs to be. And that's a global issue of importance because as the world suffers, America suffers. And we should never underestimate the impact of these kind of technologies affecting the world for, for health, not just for selling devices. So we could talk a lot about that, but I think Glenn's 3 points are really critical, need to be thought a lot about here. I think the Marshall Plan, the Marshall Plan is a good example.
Go ahead, Jim.
No, I'm sorry. It's just what the Marshall Plan did, we should have had now, and we don't. And that was to help the world kind of get back after World War II.
Well, I agree with you, Jim, that that the rapidity of the actual development of both therapy as well as vaccines has just been remarkable, and a lot of that's based on modeling and computer modeling. But a lot of it's also based on the efficiency of clinical trials now, which has moved much more to virtual and digital as opposed to physical. And we've actually seen the impacts of that on cancer phase 2 and phase 3 cancer trials. I mean, the ability to do virtual accrual and to follow has just been, improved exponentially by the use of technology and digital application. And I think that's going to continue. The fact of the matter, though, is we're not going to have long-term follow-up in terms of the vaccines, because the phase 3 trials are going to be constricted. And I'm not criticizing anyone for that. We got to get the vaccines out there. But I think the one thing that would lead to logically, and hopefully we could get a consensus on, is the need for post-marketing surveillance on steroids. And that would be a perfect rationale for sharing data, and sharing data on every single human being, at least in this country, that gets vaccinated, and how they do, basically. And I think that would be a wonderful paradigm to kind of break through a lot of the usual regulatory and bureaucratic compartmentalization. So I mean, we're trying to push that essentially.
Yeah, go ahead, David.
I think about drug being 20+% right of the total spend in healthcare, which there's a lot of waste, and then there's this explosion in these new personalized drugs that are extremely expensive. And then we have this issue of a pandemic, and it comes back to data. I mean, that's the common experience you've all described is, we don't have enough data to be able to look across the ecosystem in real time and to be able to test out things both in clinical trial recruitment, in terms of, drug testing, and in terms of, post-release surveillance. So tremendous opportunity here if we can get through that. Jim, you were going to make it.
I just wanted to pick up on Glenn's point, David, because the clinical trial space has always been kind of complicated, and NIH funding, that we've all had is great, but never sufficient and very complicated. Today, with population-based data and predictive analytics, you already know which population should be enrolled. You could target communities, get much faster enrollment using bots or whatever process you want. And then the follow-up doesn't need to be in person anymore. And so you can get follow-up proactively with other networks, through the pharmacy networks, through better locations closer to patients' homes. And so it's the advantage to the drug companies to have things enrolled faster, quicker results, earlier to market, longer time on their patent, more revenue, all to the advantage of the system. So we need to look at the cost accounting and effectiveness of the way we design things and use the technology, and work with our commercial and non-commercial partners to figure out how to do this better. We waste so much money and time in these spaces, and it's been highly ineffective. But to Glenn's point of leadership, we don't have that thought process right now. We do commercially, I think, but public-private partnerships are going to be really important in making this happen.
No,
Hey Jim, what's your What's your view on who owns the data? I mean, organizations like Microsoft have incredible capability, technological capability, and what have you, and their platforms, are an important part of their business model. But when you talk about some of the functional applications that sit on those platforms, I mean, there is a paranoid ideation that basically is nervous about secondary and tertiary business models. So would you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think it's an incredibly important point. It goes to one of your elements, trust. And I think we've seen in the healthcare space where data was used for different purposes than people believe. And that causes the trust ladder to become even higher to climb. Microsoft believes strongly that your data is your data. We're just a place to work on it. We don't have any ownership. We don't use that data. If you want us to help you do something, that's your product, your prerogative. I actually believe the patient should own their own data, and we should actually allow patients to be investors in that. I think a different model today would be to have the patient actually have ownership in some collaboration of data. If you're going to use my genetic sequencing to develop a new drug, I want to know that I get something back. It could be pennies on the dollar. But I think we've gotten so used to just taking and doing whatever we want. It's kind of like plagiarism in medicine. People take other people's work and they just write it out as if it was theirs. It's not theirs. I think we have to start to get the trust back by opening the ability of patients, consumers to be part of the process. So yeah, I don't think companies should own the data.
Yeah, I mean, I think we think the same way here at Innovaccer, and it really is about, we're not going to, I mean, this is the pandemic has exposed us. We're not going to get to where we need to be in closing time frame, knowledge gaps without really bringing all this data together. And there's public data, social determinant of health data, community data, proprietary data.
But just before you go away from this therapeutic discovery, I want to give a personal story.
Sure.
So we lost our first daughter to leukemia at age 12. One of the things exciting about Microsoft around this data is looking at the biologic sciences, right? It's not just clinical data, but one of the projects we're working on with a company called Adaptive is understanding immunotherapy and a single diagnostic blood test. So every T cell, every blood vial that we draw has 1 million T cells. Each T cell has a story. That ability to understand that story or the language of the T cell requires artificial intelligence and machine learning. We now have better diagnostic testing for COVID than anybody in the world through with the most highest specificity and sensitivity through Adaptive. That work allowed a treatment cure to be found for children like our daughter. And so now acute lymphoblastic leukemia is curable, right? So there are things happening by large computer technology companies in the biologic science and drug discovery that are incredibly important for population health. So I just wanted to throw that out there.
No, it's an amazing story, and there's just so much potential that we can have to move forward this if we can resolve this sort of data issue. And I think that's been an important piece in leadership being required for that. When I think about COVID, not only exposing this whole issue we have in need for issues around therapy determination and personalizing it down to the molecular level, there's also this issue about how we provide services. There's just so much friction in having to, take time off of work and drive and go find parking and see a primary care physician wait in the office. And, now we suddenly with COVID, it's opened up this concept of virtual care, care without loss. Thoughts about whether that's a temporary phenomena or if we're actually have the potential here to move into a new framework for care delivery. Glenn, let's start with you.
I think a huge amount of that will persist after COVID. That's number one. And I think that whenever you look at business models that are not successful in the old-fashioned way, and a good example would be genetic counseling. I mean, as we get more and more genetic markers that are predictive or that are important markers to follow during therapy, the need for genetic counseling goes way up. And genetic counseling, as Jim knows and as I found out, never paid for itself in the old-fashioned reimbursement system. But with a digital approach to genetic counseling, there's a bunch of transformative companies that are out there that are now trying to provide that. I think it changes the fundamental business model, and that's just one example, essentially. And so I think a huge amount of what has happened to create the need for digital care will continue. That's number one. Caveat number two, I'm ODing on Zoom. I don't know about everybody else, but I'm ODing. And I can't wait to be able to have some physical meetings again with people that I work with and that I respect. And I do think in terms of healthcare that a human interaction, as hopefully in a longitudinal way, is part of the therapeutic promise and part of the therapeutic delivery. So I don't think it's all going to go virtual, but I think that the combination of the ability to have physical interactions in a longitudinal way with a quarterback for your care or for your life journey in health is going to be important, but a huge amount of virtual will continue. The other thing that I believe is it will continue to move care away from hospital-centric structures. So again, I think one of the problems in dealing with the surge was that we did not have surge capacity. We were dependent upon fixed cost structures. Fixed cost structures are extraordinarily difficult to manage. They could be managed better, and I think virtual will help us continue the move away from kind of immutable fixed cost structures as a component of our healthcare delivery.
Yeah, I echo Glenn's thoughts, but broadband is critical. So we need to have broadband technology. So that needs to be diffused. I think the promise is exciting. The reality is more challenging. Everybody logically understands the ability to have hospital at home when 30 to 50% of hospital costs are unnecessary and most expensive. The issue is compliance and patients continuing on to allow this remote monitoring to actually happen. I've studied this myself and had not so good results. The cutoff or the lack of compliance over time really is impressive. So we have to be careful, just like compliance with medications or almost anything. If you don't follow through and have a continuous cycle, you're going to lose, which gets to end Glenn's engineering process, right? So idea is great, makes sense, probably could make a business model, but is it successful over time? And I'm not sure yet, but there are things like dialysis, which cost our country hundreds of billions of dollars, that probably is better done at home with better outcomes. And now with technology is probably safe. So there's some real advantages for some very difficult populations. And to Glenn's point about the human interaction, having care at home often is better for people. They have people around them, if they're lucky, to be supportive. Not everybody has that. So we have to be careful of the haves and have-nots too, because we could make that divide bigger. But exciting, I think the judgment's out.
No, absolutely. And I think, in addition to that, and we've covered this territory, AI really is more augmented intelligence, and how can it help us think through this new framework of care, what's in person, what's virtual, what's you know, AI driven, in fact, to alleviate some of the burden. Let's just check in with our audience. I know we've all been now dealing with COVID now for 9 months, and I'd like to get their sense of how they think about AI within their institution. So if each of you could just go on to the chat box and we'll take this quick poll. You know, for those of you attending, and we've got about 500 people on the line, did you have an AI plan coming into COVID and you still don't, not on the radar? You don't have on, and you need it, you know, you need one. Do you have an AI plan and it got sidelined because of COVID, or did it become accelerated? So while we're taking this poll, you know, I actually had a call from a good friend of mine who's head of innovation at Medicaid, one of the top 4 managed Medicaid organizations. And he called me up and said, I've been asked by my boss, his CEO, to develop an AI strategy, but I'm not really sure what that means. So, and you know, I've actually provided them some dialogue back and forth, but you know, what is your sense, the two of you, in terms of people's understanding of what's real, what's not real with this capability, and how it may help, particularly as they try to deal with things in the COVID? Jim, why don't we start with you?
Yes. So I lost your face here because the poll's up, but I think the interesting thing is that in various disciplines within medicine, there's a lot of thought about it. I think in pathology slides, you know, AI has tremendous potential to read pictures better than humans. We already talked about imaging. I think the other important one, where I think is really important and shouldn't be overlooked, is dentistry. You know, dental health is incredibly important to overall human health, and it's one of the areas that's not thought about enough and leads to lots of serious illnesses. But the ability to use AI to actually identify people with dental health, to prevent fraud, for things like that, and actual disease upstream is really exciting. That said, you know, I think there are you know, people who have bad thoughts about doing bad things and can disrupt networks, you know, maybe not intentionally, but the fact is that they can disrupt AI tools, and you can get false readings. And there was a paper in JAMA or Science, I think it was in Science, where they actually saw corrupted AI networks for reading eye exams, right? So just like dental or pathology, retinal readings, really good high specificity and sensitivity for diabetic retinopathy. But if you corrupt that network, which, you know, crazy people do, you can actually misread diabetic retinopathy, and the user will not realize it because of the complexities of those models. And the last thing I would say is that we have these racial tensions right now. Well, one of the places I think we've done a poor job is in AI across races. We built these models mostly with white people like me, and that's not a representative sample to build that model on. So if you take a dermatological AI model reading skin lesions in a white person and apply it to a black person, it's just not going to work. So we see this bias in some of these models as they're built that we really need to work on too. So I don't know if that exactly answers your question, but that's my thoughts.
Yeah, I think one of the curious things I have is, like, is AI just overhyped, and people really don't have a full understanding of its capabilities? Let's take a look and see what the audience has to say. Do we have the poll results? Interestingly, that 25% have an AI plan and needed to accelerate it. What do you guys think about what you're seeing here? Glenn, what do you think?
I actually as you might imagine, David, I actually object to this entire set of questions. And if I were cynical, and when I was talking to your Medicaid managed care person who wanted your help, I would have just said, well, why don't you just hire Innovaccer? We can do it for you. So that would be the cynical answer. The more, I think the more well-rounded answer is, what is it you want to change? What is it in your healthcare provision or in your MCO product that you think you need to change? Whether it's how you get access to your PCPs, or whether it's how you distribute your new genetic information, or whether in a provider group it's how you continue to update the data and the actual kind of new knowledge generation that is outstripping any human's ability to keep up, and at the same time take care of patients. And then you back down from that and say, well, what kind of enabling technology that is now available? What kind needs to be plugged in? How do we define our array of enabling technology in order to get to the fundamental changes that we decide we need to have in order to care for patients in a more optimal way, or to ensure that our patients who are part of our Medicaid MCO are getting the best health outcome? So again, I would always say, start with where you want to, move towards clinically, or what you think your responsibility should be as a Medicaid MCO or a Medicare Advantage organization or what have you, and then build in the technology that needs to be a part of that enabling.
So Glenn, that's the answer that I actually gave him, which is, so many people think about, we have to collect all this data, and they don't think about, like, what do we do now? We can't, it's not useful. Right. And you have to define what is it you're trying to do first. And then once you do that, think about what data would you need, and then how would you use it?
Well, I mean, back in the day, we were one of the first really big clients to use Epic. And, I was kind of bonded to Judy Faulkner, before she kind of left me behind and started to bond to KP. But at any rate, we had, this huge commitment to do Epic throughout our system. And it was not only a financial challenge, but it was an engineering challenge, because we had to fundamentally redesign how we cared for patients. But the next big argument I had was, well, if we've spent all this money on the EHR, why do we need to spend more money on the data warehouse? And I said, if we have all this information and we don't have an ability to analyze it in order to determine how to take the next step in the caregiving, it doesn't make sense. So, you have to say, well, what's the reason for the EHR? The reason for the EHR is obviously to make communications much more efficient, but it's also to aggregate data, to analyze the data, and then to make the next step in improving how care is given. So that was the rationale for the data warehouse, which on the face of it now, looking back, seems, absolutely common sense, but it had to be justified by a clinical improvement and a clinical outcome for improved care. And that's the way I would answer the question about the AI.
Yeah, Jim, there's a lot of opportunity here, I think, in terms of
Yeah, I guess we don't want to have a solution looking for a problem, but
right.
I do think the cloud is a very interesting game changer. Yep. Because unlike the on-premises systems that we all have to run 24/7 and have special rooms and all that, the cloud lets you run off premises when you need it, just in time. It's backed up, it's more secure. Cybersecurity is going to become a bigger and bigger problem. So I think the cloud in this space with AI and things like that becomes really important to transition these disparate databases into a common data lake that can be turned on or off. You can audit them much better on who's using them, et cetera, and for what purpose. So cloud's going to change things maybe faster than AI, but having the cloud with that data will enhance the ability to use AI better.
Yeah, kudos for saying that, because for us here, we're a data company and we don't do anything unless it's in cloud, and that's the way we've tried to continue to move people, and we see an acceleration as you have there at Microsoft as a partner. And there's everything that we can help with in terms of once that data is organized and available very quickly in the cloud, to be able to use AI to start thinking about, and I know you did certainly for COVID with chatbots, how do you help to get people diagnosed? How do you get them recommended treatment based on their responses, and then think about improving efficiency of workflow for the clinical workers in healthcare, making them more effective. And I think about data as in enabling technologies. How do we make the people better people, right, in healthcare, people that work in healthcare, and how do we make patients more empowered? And there's also this cost saving. I mean, both of you have thought a lot about the waste in healthcare. It's a tremendous opportunity. Glenn, I know you've talked a lot about this.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And everybody, there's this argument about whether our system is inefficient because of the price per unit, or whether it's inappropriate units, and it's a combination of both, obviously. And the reason that I focused on the inappropriate units is because, I mean, if I just went after price, when you look at the logical extension of that, I would be going after how much we could compensate vascular surgeons, and in fact the market determined that if our institution were off market, we would lose our vascular surgeons, we would lose our neurosurgeons, God knows, Jim, we would lose our orthopedic surgeons. And so the market, the market really determined my competitive compensation, whether it was base compensation or whether it was incentive based. But what I could go after was overutilization or misutilization and what have you. But it's really a combination of both. And you can't, you certainly can't do that. And there's been many. The RAND study in 2003 showed that only 55% of all the surveyed care was thought to be optimal. Actually, Beth McGlynn just updated that RAND study in a recent New England Journal of Medicine commentary. It hasn't changed at all. And and we couldn't have, even back in the day pre-cloud, when we were putting together all of our own data aggregation capability and analysis, you couldn't go after that, that 40 or 45% of suboptimal caregiving without having the data and the analytics and being able to feed that data in real time back to your providers. And now with the cloud and the stuff that, Jim is developing at Microsoft, it's actually potentially scalable, and it's a hell of a lot less costly.
Yeah, I think that
there's the issue of cost, but one of the issues, I mean, you've been a good mentor to me, particularly recently around what we're doing together, and you've really focused on, it's not just cost, right? It's the ability to improve outcome.
No, I think the issue I want to pick up on Glenn's and your question is today, administrative structures can cross different systems. And depending on the payment system, which always interferes with things. So, I mean, Glenn was always good about being in kind of risk system with his own plan, his own health plan. If you're in a fee-for-service world, a lot of this stuff's interesting, but gets in the way of you making money. And so we have to be honest about planning and what the expectations are within the customer's world, right? Because, in a fee-for-service world, it's a very different world than a risk contract health plan world, where total cost of care really counts. And to Glenn's point, if you're designing a system to just grind out orthopedic spine surgery cases, don't mess with my productivity and the way I'm doing this, because I got enough RVUs to get paid a lot. If you're working in a benchmark ACO contract world where it's total cost of care, you want to maybe minimize the number of spine surgeries only for those who are absolutely indicated. That gets into the ability to actually use upfront data and prediction models to actually allow you to understand who is the best surgical candidate with the best outcome a priori before you cut them open. And at Dartmouth, we used what Glenn's familiar with, shared decision making. But through the sport trial we did in spine surgery, we could actually ask the patient 8 questions and show them what their outcome would be with or without surgery for the next 8 to 10 years. Those are the kind of things that you would do in a total cost of care model that you might not do in a fee-for-service model, and the system you would build for those 2 different models are quite different.
Yeah, I'm
But you know, Jim, but you know, Jim, even in a fee-for-service model, when you're looking at what I believe is going to be less reimbursement per unit of care, and I would bet on that no matter what, you need to understand the cost of your goods. Every other industry in the world has attacked its cost of delivering a product or cost of goods. And a lot of what we are talking about now with enabling technology allows that once you have robust indications for something, and that's going to be critical, absolutely critical, even in a fee-for-service world.
Yeah, totally agree. And I keep challenging David, as I do Microsoft, what's the value added for implementing your software, for your product, for your cloud, right? Show me what the return on investment is for me to manage this population of 100,000 people over the next year. We should be able to do that today.
Now, you've really helped me think about that. And as we've got 2 surgeons historically, and I'm the cognitivist, so, and particularly thinking about it from a cognitive perspective.
Surgeons are cognitive too.
Of course.
Yeah, we just find out whether we're right or wrong, whereas you never find out, David.
But really is, how do we augment the human experience? I was going to say, Glenn and I did a recent webinar on the perioperative surgical home model with Doug Stakey from Advocate Aurora. And we talked about this whole issue of, risk determination prior, and then assignment of management and information and decision-making pre-surgically to really have the best outcomes. I just want to wrap this up. This has been such a great discussion. There are a lot of points made by Glenn, who was a real leader in helping us think through primary care, and certainly for you, Jim, where you really thought very early on about the use of data and trying to understand why outcomes are different for different folks, and just tremendous contributions you've both made to the field. A little bit of how you've influenced we think about things here at Innovaccer is this use of data. How do you get data from everywhere, get it into the cloud, unify, and make it useful, particularly so it's patient-centered, because that's really the sense of making it a humanized experience and primary care focused. And then how do you use AI to really help the various stakeholders, the team, give AI decision support for a physician, help to coordinate care for high-risk patients through care coordinators, and how do you empower the patient, through their smartphone to make better decision and engage everybody as a team. And then also, I think to Glenn's point, how do you really be able to manage the cost of care and the quality of care? And I think, certainly, Jim, you've talked a lot about innovation. How do you sort of command centers across the population or a private system to really learn? And that's really what technology should be about, is augmented intelligence. Thank you both very much. This has been a wonderful dialogue. I've really enjoyed the experience. And thank you all in the audience. We had a great turnout. Really appreciate your participation. And we'll look forward to the next webinar. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Take care.
Thanks very much.
Take care.
And this concludes the webinar.